Do you know who is Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah ibn Sina? Avicenna was a child prodigy. By the age of 10, he had memorized the Quran and was well versed in Arabic literature. He studied Islamic law, philosophy, and natural sciences under prominent scholars of his time. By 16, he had mastered medicine and began treating patients, including royalty. And more, he was the most intelligent boy at the time. If he just reads a book once, he could easily remembers each and everything from that book. Life and education. According to Avicenna's personal account of his life, as communicated in the records of his longtime pupil Al-Juzjani, he read and memorized the entire Quran by age 10. The tutor Natili instructed the youth in elementary logic, and, having soon surpassed his teacher, Avicenna took to studying the Hellenistic authors on his own. By age 16, Avicenna turned to medicine, a discipline over which he claimed easy mastery. When the Sultan of Bokhara fell ill with an ailment that baffled the court physicians, Avicenna was called to his bedside and cured him. In gratitude, the Sultan opened the Royal Samanid Library to him, a fortuitous benevolence that introduced Avicenna to a veritable cornucopia of science and philosophy. Avicenna began his prodigious writing career at age 21. Some 240 extant titles bear his name. They crossed numerous fields, including mathematics, geometry, astronomy, physics, metaphysics, philology, music, and poetry. Often caught up in the tempestuous political and religious strife of the era, Avicenna's scholarship was unquestionably hampered by a need to remain on the move. At Ifan, under al-Dawla, he found the stability and security that had eluded him. If Avicenna could be said to have had any halcyon days, they occurred during his time at Ifan, where he was insulated from political intrigues and could hold his own scholars' court every Friday, discussing topics at will. In this salubrious climate, Avicenna completed Kitab al-Shif, wrote Danish Nama al, Book of Knowledge, and Kitab al-Najat, Book of Salvation, and compiled new and more accurate astronomical tables. While in the company of al-Dawla, Avicenna fell ill with colic. He treated himself by employing the heroic measure of 8 self-administered celery seed enemas in one day. However, the preparation was either inadvertently or intentionally altered by an attendant to include 5 measures of active ingredient instead of the prescribed 2. That caused ulceration of the intestines. Following up with Mithridate, a mild opium remedy attributed to Mithridates 6 Eupator, king of Pontus, 120 to 63 BCE, a slave attempted to poison Avicenna by surreptitiously adding a surfeit of opium. Weakened but indefatigable, he accompanied al-Dawla on his march to Hamadan. On the way he took a severe turn for the worse, lingered for a while, and died in the holy month of Ramadan. Major contributions, influence in philosophy and science. In 1919 to 20, British Orientalist and acclaimed authority on Persia Edward G. Brown opined that Avicenna was a better philosopher than physician, but Al-Razi raises, a better physician than philosopher, a conclusion oft repeated ever since. But a judgment issued 800 years later begs the question, by what contemporary measure is an appraisal of better made? Several points are needed to make the philosophical and scientific views of these men comprehensible today. Theirs was the culture of the Abbasid Caliphate, 750 to 1258, the final ruling dynasty built on the precepts of the first Muslim community, Ummah, in the Islamic world. Thus, their cultural beliefs were remote from those of the 20th century West and those of their Hellenistic predecessors. Their worldview was theocentric, centered on God, rather than anthropocentric, centered on humans, a perspective known to the Greco-Roman world. Their cosmology was a unity of natural, supernatural, and preternatural realms. Avicenna's cosmology centralized God as the creator, the first cause, the necessary being from whom emanated the 10 intelligences and whose immutable essence and existence reigned over those intelligences. The first intelligence descended on down to the active intelligence, which communicated to humans through its divine light, a symbolic attribute deriving authority from the Quran. Avicenna's most important work of philosophy and science is Kitab al-Shif, which is a 4-part encyclopedia covering logic, physics, mathematics, and metaphysics. Since science was equated with wisdom, Avicenna attempted a broad unified classification of knowledge. For example, in the physics section, nature is discussed in the context of 8 principal sciences, including the sciences of general principles, of celestial and terrestrial bodies, and of primary elements, as well as meteorology, mineralogy, botany, zoology, and psychology, science of the soul. The subordinate sciences, in order of importance, as designated by Avicenna, are medicine, astrology, physiognomy, the study of the correspondence of psychological characteristics to physical structure, oniromancy, the art of dream interpretation, talismans, objects with magical power to blend the celestial forces with the forces of particular worldly bodies, giving rise to extraordinary action on earth, theurgy, the secrets of prodigies, whereby the combining of terrestrial forces are made to produce remarkable actions and effects, and alchemy, an arcane art studied by Avicenna, although he ultimately rejected its transmutationism, the notion that base metals, such as copper and lead, could be transformed into precious metals, such as gold and silver. Mathematics is divided into 4 principal sciences: numbers and arithmetic, geometry and geography, astronomy, and music. Influence in medicine, Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, an edition of Iranian physician Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, Al-Canon fi al-Tib. Despite a general assessment favoring al-Razi's medical contributions, many physicians historically preferred Avicenna for his organization and clarity. Indeed, his influence over Europe's great medical schools extended well into the early modern period. There the Canon of Medicine, Al-Canon fi al-Ib, became the preeminent source, rather than al-Razi's Kitab al-Ib with Macron W, comprehensive book. Avicenna's penchant for categorizing becomes immediately evident in the canon, which is divided into 5 books. The first book contains 4 treatises, the first of which examines the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, in light of Greek physician Galen of Pergamum's 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The first treatise also includes anatomy. The second treatise examines etiology, cause, and symptoms, while the third covers hygiene, health and sickness, and death's inevitability. The fourth treatise is a therapeutic nosology, classification of disease, and a general overview of regimens and dietary treatments. Book 2 of the canon is a materia medica. Book 3 covers head-to-toe diseases, Book 4 examines diseases that are not specific to certain organs, fevers and other systemic and humoral pathologies, and Book V presents compound drugs, e.g., theriacs, mithridates, electuaries, and cathartics. Books 2 and V each offer important compendia of about 760 simple and compound drugs that elaborate upon Galen's humoral pathology. Unfortunately, Avicenna's original clinical records, intended as an appendix to the canon, were lost, and only an Arabic text has survived in a Roman publication of 1593. Yet, he obviously practiced Greek physician Hippocrates' treatment of spinal deformities with reduction techniques, an approach that had been refined by Greek physician and surgeon Paul of Aegina. Reduction involved the use of pressure and traction to straighten or otherwise correct bone and joint deformities such as curvature of the spine. The techniques were not used again until French surgeon Jean-François Callot reintroduced the practice in 1896. Avicenna's suggestion of wine as a wound dressing was commonly employed in medieval Europe. He also described a condition known as Persian fire, anthrax, correctly correlated the sweet taste of urine to diabetes, and described the guinea worm. Avicenna's influence extends into modern medical practice. Evidence-based medicine, for example, is often presented as a wholly contemporary phenomenon driven by the double-blind clinical trial. But, as medical historian Michael McFaw pointed out, medieval physicians went to great pains to build their practices upon reliable evidence. Here, Avicenna played a leading role as a prominent figure within the Greco-Arabic literature that influenced such 13th century physicians as Arnold of Villanova, circa 1235 to 1313, Bernard de Gordon, FL 1270–1330, and Nicholas of Poland, circa 1235–1316. It was Avicenna's concept of a proprietas, a consistently effective remedy founded directly upon experience, that permitted the testing and confirmation of remedies within a context of rational causation. Avicenna, and to a lesser extent Rhazes, gave many prominent medieval healers a framework of medicine as an empirical science integral to what Machva called a rational schema of nature. This should not be assumed to have led medieval physicians to construct a modern nosology or to develop modern research protocols. However, it is equally ahistorical to dismiss the contributions of Avicenna, and the Greco-Arabic literature of which he was such a prominent part, to the construction of modalities of care that were fundamentally evidence-based. Legacy of Avicenna. It is difficult to fully assess Avicenna's personal life. Most of what is known of Avicenna is found in the autobiography dictated to his longtime protégé Al-Juzjani. While his life was embellished by friends and vilified by foes, by all accounts he loved life and had a voracious appetite for lively music, strong drink, and promiscuous sex. Avicenna's mercurial wit and expansive brilliance won him many friends, but his flouting of Islamic puritanical conventions earned him even more enemies. At times he appears arrogant. While he borrowed heavily from Al-Razi, Avicenna dismissed his Persian predecessor by insisting that he should have stuck to testing stools and urine. Avicenna also appears to have been a lonely, brooding figure, whose efforts at self-promotion were often tempered by a cagey instinct for survival in a politically volatile world. Despite Avicenna's personal strengths and weaknesses, his intelligence was great in theoretical and practical matters. In addition to Avicenna's philosophy having been readily incorporated into medieval European scholastic thought, his synthesis of Neoplatonic and Aristotelian thought and his encompassing of all human knowledge of the time into well-organized accessible texts make him one of the greatest intellects since Aristotle. British philosopher Anthony Flou's appraisal of Avicenna as one of the greatest thinkers ever to write in Arabic expresses the modern scholarly assessment of the man. In medicine, Avicenna exerted a profound influence over the schools of Europe into the 17th century. The canon was subjected to increasing criticism by Renaissance instructors, yet, because Avicenna's text adhered to the practice and theories of medicine described in Greco-Roman texts, instructors used it to introduce their students to the basic principles of science. Avicenna, never wanting for enemies, was as true in death as in life. Medieval physician Arnold of Villanova berated Avicenna as a professional scribbler who had stupefied European physicians by his misinterpretation of Galen. But such an assertion is heavy-handed. Indeed, without Avicenna much knowledge would have been lost. Furthermore, his resilience over the centuries belies Villanova's conclusion. Lecturing in 1913, Canadian physician and professor of medicine Sir William Osler described Avicenna as the author of the most famous medical textbook ever written. Osler added that Avicenna, as a practitioner, was the prototype of the successful physician who was at the same time statesman, teacher, philosopher, and literary man. Taken in his entirety, Avicenna must be seen in context with his Islamic colleagues, Al-Razi, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Al-Ibn al-Abs, Hali Abbas, Abu al-Qasim, al-Bukasis, Ibn Zuhr, Avenzoar, and others, who, during the Islamic Golden Age, served as invaluable conduits of textual transmission and interpretation of Hellenistic learning for an amnesic Europe. First through Sicily and Spain and then via the Crusades, the rich cultural enlightenment of the Islamic world awakened a benighted Europe from its intellectual slumber, and Avicenna was perhaps the movement's greatest ambassador. Avicenna's continued importance as a towering figure in Islamic history may be seen in his tomb at Hamadan. Even though it had fallen into disrepair by the early 20th century, Osler noted that the great Persian has still a large practice, as his tomb is much visited by pilgrims, among whom cures are said to be not uncommon. In the 1950s the tomb was refurbished and transformed into an impressive mausoleum adorned with an imposing Mughal-inspired tower, and a museum and 8,000-volume library were added as well. Avicenna's resting place remains a major stop for tourists in the region. Now, as when he was alive, the great physician and philosopher continues to attract the attention of scholars and the public alike. Islamic philosophy, doctrines of the philosophers of the 9th to 12th century Islamic world who wrote primarily in Arabic. These doctrines combine Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism with other ideas introduced through Islam. Islamic philosophy is related to but distinct from the theological doctrines and movements in Islam. Al-Kindi, for instance, one of the first Islamic philosophers, flourished in a milieu in which the dialectic theology, kalam, of the Mutazila movement spurred much of the interest and investment in the study of Greek philosophy, but he himself was not a participant in the theological debates of the time. Al-Razi, meanwhile, was influenced by contemporary theological debates on atomism in his work on the composition of matter. Christians and Jews also participated in the philosophical movements of the Islamic world, and schools of thought were divided by philosophic rather than religious doctrine. Other influential thinkers include the Persians Al-Farabi and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, as well as the Spaniard Averroes, Ibn Rushd, whose interpretations of Aristotle were taken up by both Jewish and Christian thinkers. When the Arabs dominated Andalusian Spain, the Arabic philosophic literature was translated into Hebrew and Latin. In Egypt around the same time, the philosophic tradition was developed by Moses Maimonides and Ibn Khaldun. The prominence of classical Islamic philosophy declined in the 12th and 13th centuries in favor of mysticism, as articulated by thinkers such as Al-Ghazali and Ibn al-Arab, and traditionalism, as promulgated by Ibn Taymiyyah. Nonetheless, Islamic philosophy, which reintroduced Aristotelianism to the Latin West, remained influential in the development of medieval scholasticism and of modern European philosophy.